Okay, this is called Symptomatic Breathing, What Breathing Indicates or Not, from Samuel Delaney to René Gladman. How do variations in respiratory intensity, variations in the magnitude, tempo, sound, thickness, texture, or temperature of an ongoing exchange of gas, toxins, and particles prompt us varyingly to apprehend ourselves and others as symptoms? To explore symptomatic framings of breathing and breathers, I turn to works of speculative fiction by African-American queer writers, Samuel Delaney's Dahlgren from 1975, and René Gladman's Ravika series, whose 3 published books as of now are Event Factory, 2010, The Ravikant, 2011, and Anna Petova Crosses a Bridge, 2013. In these texts, breathing fluctuations lead characters to see their own embodiment and experience, as well as their peers, as symptomatic of greater phenomena. Socio-ecological crises occurring in the Midwestern metropolis of Bologna in Dahlgren and in the city-state of Ravika in the Ravika series, but also personal and impersonal intimacies, such as situations of contact, sex, or care. A phenomenology and a sociology of symptomaticity, this is what I'm after here. So this talk derives from a broader project titled We Don't Breathe Alone, Forms of Encounter in Anglophone North America since the 1970s, which posits breathing as a formal concept for multiple kinds and scales of encounter in contemporary literature and film concerned with crises. Throughout the chapters, notably on aesthetic self-medication in New Age genres of breathing and life writing, and on feminist configurations of breathing in the wake of the second wave, I insist on the provisional, volatile characters of the structures for living and dying afforded by breathing. In this talk, I explicitly tackle the value of breathing's limitedness and fickleness as a resource for moving through personal, ecological, and social crises. As they mediate between individual and milieu, experience and expression, and the psychic and the somatic, respiratory symptoms, I argue, stress as socially and ethically relevant the very fact that there are limitations and an essential instability to the knowledge that they help us gain about ourselves, others, and the world. I propose the notion of symptomatic breathing to describe encounters, even in circumstances where embodiment and experience seem blatantly legible, with alterity, an incommensurable yet shifting limit to what is knowable and identifiable. The phrase symptomatic breathing riffs on symptomatic reading, a way of interpreting that Sharon Marcus and Stephen Best identify as dominant in literary criticism from the 1970s onwards. Associated with Marxist and psychoanalytic traditions, symptomatic reading, according to Marcus and Best's gloss, takes meaning to be hidden, repressed, deep, and in need of detection and disclosure by an interpreter. My objective here isn't to intervene in debates on symptomatic versus non-symptomatic reading, or as they've been reframed since the publication of Marcus and Best's polemical essay, debates on critical versus post-critical modes. And still, it's worth noting that breathing invites a model of symptomaticity that complicates symptomatic interpretation as Marcus and Best imagine or caricature it. As we try to find out what variations in the intensity of breathing are about, what they mean, we deal with the phenomenon literally and figuratively up in the air, and thus lack the convenience of a surface depth model. What's more, Gladman's character, and this is importantly less true of Delaney's protagonist in Dahlgren, as I show in what comes next, do not necessarily presume that attending to, say, respiratory disorders leads to the accurate diagnostic of an individual disposition or environmental crisis. Attending to breathing is a way for Gladman's characters to learn and relearn the limits of interpretation itself, the impossibility of what we could call, by tweaking Frederick Jameson's famous concept, the psychosomatic mapping of a crisis's totality. And really, there's no reason to tie symptomaticity to epistemological totalization or stability. If it's been typecast in literary criticism, the symptom appears, throughout the long history of medicine, less as a straightforward vector pointing to a reliable diagnosis than as a marker of self-difference. Given how fuzzy the line is between the symptom and the feeling of a self can be, Brooke Holmes writes, symptoms, our own and those we observe in others, compel us to consider an inhuman otherness within the self, or the fact that we always, and at times despite ourselves, incorporate much of an unseen world. Autoimmune disorders, like the variations in respiratory intensity that often accompany them, dramatized in the register of the ordinary or in that of the event, the internalization of otherness. As Ed Cohen explains, in autoimmunity, immunity's self-destructive corollary, the self appears itself as both self and not self. If immunity constitutes an immune reaction to tissues of the self itself, then it constitutes a real and hence a vital contradiction. Similarly, respiratory symptoms confront us over and over again with a vital contradiction. We, like all the organisms around us, are both ourselves and not ourselves. We are what we breathe, or put differently, breathing keeps us from entirely being ourselves. Numerous critics have categorized Dahlgren as science fiction, and it's true that the novel, like the Vargese series, describes reality as it appears at certain odd times of the day in certain weathers, as Ursula Le Guin says sci-fi does. And still, these books might more accurately be labeled works of speculative fiction, a genre that, as Joel Gomez puts it, eschews a space-age setting and scientific jargon of much sci-fi, while postulating a time and circumstance as yet unknown. The particular brand of speculative fiction that Dahlgren and the Vargese series exemplify also represent a decidedly lo-fi counterpart to Afrofuturism. While Dahlgren and the Vargese series concern themselves less with black identity and subjectivity than with singularity and difference more broadly, more on this later, they, like Afrofuturistic texts, shape race and other identity categories as contingent processes, or notions that are programmed and reprogrammed along with changes in life conditions. Breathing in this context constitutes at once a locus where race, gender, disability, class, and so on are visceralized, and a site where bodies, environments, and their respective limits can only be apprehended as matters of speculation. Now, when breathing variations impose themselves as symptoms of dispositions or conditions, and when attending to and tracking these symptoms amplifies encounters with alterity, what kinds of self and social relation emerge? First up, Dahlgren. Dahlgren begins in the middle of a sentence that started, or will start, at the end of the novel, Finnegan's Wake style, as the protagonist howls for the world to give him a name. What follows is communication that isn't merely airborne, but air or breath made. The in-dark answers him with wind, and for a whole minute he listens to his breath sound tumble down. An Asian American woman, the novel identifies her as Oriental, arrives, whispering something that is all breath, and the wind comes for the words and dusts away the meaning. After the pair have sex and make a warm place with their mingled breath, the woman leads him to a cave where he finds a chain of prisms, mirrors, and lenses, as well as a weapon called an orchid. Witnessing his new companion turn into a tree, our protagonist hops on a truck and is dropped off at the end of a bridge leading to Bologna. Kid, or Kid with two Ds, or the Kid, as the protagonist is eventually called, sets foot in Bologna in the wake of an unspecified cataclysm. As a draft of the novel's front matter indicates, archival research, what only months ago was a great city has turned into a disaster zone, a haven for the lost, the degenerate, the insane. Technology is out, chronology is arbitrary, buildings burn down, build themselves back up, and burn down again. The air is saturated with smoke. No. Yeah. The smoke hides the sky's variety, stains consciousness, covers the Holocaust with something safe and insubstantial. It protects from greater flame. It indicates fire but obscures the source. This is not a useful city. Very little here approaches any eidolon of the beautiful. The smoke, which both indicates and distracts from more destructive or greater flame, symptomatizes the crisis that has made Bologna useless. Smoke, at the same time as it acts as the medium through which Kid apprehends Bologna, preserves the city's opacity. Kid's attempt to make sense of his environment in the midst of a thick smoke unfolds as a problem of language. The common problem, Kid surmises, is to have more to say than vocabulary and syntax can bear. And yet language here is not a given. Words are not the units, building blocks, or raw materials with which Kid writes. As hinted by my earlier account of Kid's communication throughout the novel's inaugural pages, language here is further divisible into breaths and sounds whose sequencing has meaning. Take, for instance, the transition from lost LOST to lost LUST in an account of Kid's sexual encounter with Lanya, one of his more regular partners. The encounter in question starts the way so many others do in Dahlgren, with Kid acquiring through his breathing a vague sense of the smoke-filled atmosphere in which he's immersed. Kid stepped outside and breathed deep in the thick smoke. He couldn't smell it, but he felt his heart in his ears in a moment, very quick and steady. Synesthetically, Kid here apprehends smoke not as a smell or as a density, but as a rhythm. Or perhaps what Kid apprehends is the rhythmicity of his own breathing, a breathing so contaminated by smoke that it becomes a metonym for it. As Kid and Lanya get closer to each other, a respiratory choreography or sequence of deep breaths and breathless instants scores a temporary suspension of, though not an abstraction from, the experience of toxicity. Lanya's breath warmed in the hair on Kid's back, recounts the narrator. Slightly further, she moved and held her breath for half a minute, gasped, held it again, gasped. Kid focuses on Lanya's breathing too as he's about to orgasm, and that's a weird sentence. So he said that's in the book. The realization from her movement, her breaths were loud, long, and wet beside him, the underside of her tongue between his knuckles hot, that it was what she had wanted, made him, perhaps 40 seconds after her, come. So at the beginning of this scene, Kid approaches his quick breathing as a symptom of Bologna's smoke-filled atmosphere, a symptom that takes him nowhere beyond the city's opacity, or the crisis's opacity. By the scene's conclusion, however, he treats the loudness, length, and wetness of Lanya's breaths as if they gave him a privileged access to her inner life. As such, Kid's relation to breathing isn't exactly, at least not consistently, symptomatic as I've been using the term. That is, as prompting a recognition of the limitations and essential instability of knowledge about oneself, others, and the world. Granted, in breathing the toxic air of Bologna, Kid encounters and processes an irreducible alterity, an external matter that, by entering his body, dramatizes his self-estrangement or the enigmatic status of his identity. Mary K. Bray argues that although Kid isn't black, as are many members of the Scorpions, a gang whose leader he eventually becomes, his doubleness as a half-Native American, half-white individual recalls what W.E.B. Du Bois describes as double consciousness, an internal conflict experienced by members of subordinated groups who must survive in an oppressive society. Kid, a living catachresis, a Native American considered a foreigner at the heart of America, is compelled, as he breathes Bologna's smoke, to formulate his identity in the interrogative mode. But Kid doesn't approach breathing by or with his romantic and sexual partners with comparable interpretive humility. Reading Lanya's breath as a statement of her desires and intentions, he enacts paranoid interpretation in Eve Kozofsky-Sedgwick's sense of the term. He takes Lanya's breathing to be about him. Kid partakes in respiratory tourism. He moves across Bologna, breathes its air, and encounters an alterity he sometimes recognizes to be beyond the reach of his understanding, and sometimes misrecognizes as datum about himself. In Bologna, Kid engages in contacts as he cruises, taking as his object of cathexis not any individual in a personal sense, but, in Michael Warner's definition of the practice, the very publicness of sexual culture. For the Obersonic cruising, which stages an intimacy with an unknown body, epitomizes the formalism of sexuality. So as we seek to encounter ourselves in the world, we extend beyond ourselves and encounter alterity. Having transgressed our limits, we encounter ourselves as non-self-identical. So that's 2 books and a graph. As breathers, we are, of course, never self-identical, comfortably within our limits. And this is especially obvious in Kid's case, for whom identity comes with a question mark and develops through interactions. Accordingly, Kid's respiratory tourism induces less self-shattering than an intensification of what Elizabeth Freeman calls an inhabitation by and of the other, or as we might more accurately call it, an inhalation by and of the other. Yet, Kid ultimately reincorporates this alterity, or the alterity he encounters, into a narcissistic structure. So breathing does confront him with otherness, his own and that of his partners, but as a relatively privileged figure, a man and eventually an acclaimed poet and a relatively powerful gang leader, he's able to disavow, consciously or not, the specific manifestation of otherness. Kid can and must keep moving from one encounter to the next. Dahlgren, after all, is a loop. It's also sci-fi because he's a poet and very powerful. Um, okay, now onto the Ravika series. So the Ravika volumes and Dahlgren as objects couldn't look more different. The former range between 120 and 170 pages, while the latter approximates 800 pages in most of its editions. And yet, Gladman and Delaney's books share key thematics and tropes. Like Dahlgren, Event Factory, the first installment of Gladman's series, opens as an unnamed figure, this one a linguist and ethnographer, apprehends through the opaque air an unfamiliar city plagued with an ambiguous crisis. She at first describes the yellowish air as smoke-filled, but later amends this description. Honestly, she says there was no smoke. I meant silence, but silence is not something that moves visibly from one place to another. So the word smoke here fills in for a crisis silent about its nature. Smoke stands for but says nothing about this crisis, one that we learn only in the Ravikians, might have to do with structures becoming ash in the wake of a large fire, an attack from above. In the Ravikians, the second volume of the series, Luzvaj Amini, the great Ravikian novelist, and our new narrator, is en route to a reading by an old friend, Zaurtur Limici. Anapatova crosses a bridge. The third installment is, for its part, dominated by the voice of its titular character, a friend of Amini. Amini says of Petova that she is not exactly Ravikian. This vague assessment locates Petova in a liminal category, not unlike Kids, between the foreign expert who narrates Event Factory and the local, or in fact exceptional citizen who narrates the Ravikians. In the Ravika series, too, language is divisible into breaths. In the interest of not repeating myself, I want to focus on Gladman's innovation when it comes to the interplay between language and breathing. To apprehend breathing, one's own and others in the series, is to apprehend oneself and one's peers in translation. In her quest to uncover the crisis plaguing Ravika, the central figure in Event Factory encounters a people. And those people, they're called the Essaleons. Once Ravikians, the Essaleons, following a rebellion, became a faction and developed their own language, Essaleye. Our narrator, who's unfamiliar with Essaleye, understands the Essaleons to be speaking in gaps and air. Or, as Gladman puts it in A Personal Correspondent, in gasps of the unintelligible, a kind of embodied absence or unknown, a way of giving the unknown a shape. And that is parenthetically probably the best definition of a symptom I've ever heard. And so note the inversion here. Gaps in air in the text and gasp of meaning in Gladman's correspondence. And the opposite, gasp of air and gaps in meaning, would be more intuitive. But the inversion here mashes up breathing and communication. Were she to describe the Essaleons' life in an idiom of their own, the narrator says she would need a symbol to represent air. An encounter with Olchi, a Ravikian whom the narrator of Event Factory befriends in her quest to discover the nature of Ravika's crisis, dramatizes the way breathing functions as a symptom that translates and thus both reveals and obscures its source. One's senses, observes the narrator, eventually grow accustomed to an environment, the environment in which one is living. After she meets him, Olchi starts coughing with increased frequency and intensity, which prompts him to frame himself, his own bad breathing, as a symptom of Ravika's crisis. So he says, something is not right in Ravika, with a voice that's barely audible. Something has not been right for a long time, the narrator corrects, so the situation must be escalating. But why was it affecting him physically? So to answer that question, so the question of what is the crisis and why does it affect people physically, she first works comparatively, trying to register her own health. But this focus conduces to sensory overload. The signals from my body were scattered and despondent. I decided to ignore this information entirely. So as a result, she turns to Olchi, who she says had just one symptom. He could not breathe. So the narrator then notices that Olchi has entered a crisis episode. Olchi's brown had turned into a deepening purple, and his body appeared gripped against an uncalming seizure. He reached for me. He wanted something. One hand was opening and closing repeatedly. I managed to make out the word, tirem, which in Ravik means pen. It was the pen in my hand he wanted. I gave it to him. He used it to make a mark on his stomach that resembled an O. He said, Hameyeni, push me. I did. I pushed fastly, with all my weight. I settled on that point, pressed as if a door might open. He let out a belch, and beautiful yellow began to flow into his lungs. What happened? I asked once he had recovered. I don't know, but this wasn't the first time. You've lost your breath before? Earlier. When? Not long ago, but... And in high Ravican form, he began to gesticulate dramatically, to hide the story and the dance, as they say there. I did not take this subversion personally. This was Ravica. Though whatever had stopped his breathing and then restarted it, it was symptomatic of the bigger problem with the city. Alci, where do people go here to find the truth? I got the question out, but figured it would be difficult for him to answer. Ravicans prefer not to share this kind of information. It belongs to the community. If you do not know it, this is because you're not supposed to. So does the narrator here perforate Alci's body to let air in, or does she simply put pressure on the O as a strategy to catalyze inhalation and exhalation that take place through more conventional channels of breathing? The nose, the mouth, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, bronchi, lungs, and diaphragm. I'm not exactly sure. But reflecting on this event, on this loss of breath, the narrator assesses that whatever had stopped Alci's breathing and then restarted it, it was symptomatic of the bigger problem with this city. The narrator deduces that the referent of Alci's symptom is the crisis playing out in Ravica, but she lacks a language for articulating the nature of the interplay between symptom and crisis. Alci's symptom here is a Lacanian symptom, a node in the exchange of signifiers where meaning undoes itself. Alci's bad breathing both gives the narrator information about the crisis and reminds her that this information is limited, that it refers to an experience that is not hers. As she eventually sums up, the crisis ravaging Ravica's population still had not become my crisis. The Ravicans would not allow it. We might at last approach the ethics that emerges from symptomatic breathing in the Ravica series through Emmanuel Levinas' pneumatism. While Levinas is primarily known for his ethics of the face-to-face encounter, his philosophy of pneumatism presents the point of suspension between inhalation and exhalation, a breathlessness inseparable from the structure of breathing, as an instant where we turn to the other, and as such find ourselves in the realm of ethics. We might also think of the ethical problem laid out by Gladman in light of the Martinican writer, poet, and philosopher Edouard Glissant's Poetics of Relation, which states that being is relation, but relation is safe from the idea of being. Relation contaminates, sweetens as a principle or as flower dust. Relation inferals, lying in wait for equivalence. That which would pre-exist relation is vacuity of being as being. Being as being is not opaque but self-important, suffisant. Relation struggles and states itself in opacity, it differs, diffère, self-importance. Against a notion of being as being that is self-sufficient or self-identical, Glissant posits a concept of relation that inferals, or that, in the realm of opacity, both differs and induces difference in being as being. Opacity, per Zach Blas's gloss, constitutes an alterity that is unquantifiable, a diversity that exceeds categories of identifiable difference, and that must be defended in order for any radically democratic project to succeed. A poetics of opacity like Glissant's uses as the ground zero of social relations the partial illegibility of pleasure and pain. And most importantly, as Sadiya Hartman and Zakiya Iman Jackson teach us in their work on, respectively, Scenes of Black Subjection and Racial Plasticity, a poetics of opacity refuses to weaponize illegibility. To record and register opacity, one's own and others, even when embodiment and experience seem overdetermined by individual and environmental conditions, that is the work of symptomatic breathing.